Well, our host has read out Shashi Tharoor's potted history from Wikipedia, but I'll make it simpler. I'll make it simpler. I think just one word is enough for Shashi, and that word is protean. He's a man of so many parts, as an international diplomat, a great writer, an absolutely indefatigable columnist and newspaper writer, and now, of course, a member of parliament serving his second term from Thiruvananthapuram. This is a particular privilege for me to be in Pune with Shashi, because Shashi and I go back a very long way. We were at Delhi University together in the early 70s. And though he's just corrected me here, I'm 1 year his senior, not 2 as I'd imagined. I hope this won't be a very lazy or restful conversation.
Oh, that's why I just unbuttoned my jacket.
Shashi, you know, I go back to St. Stephen's College, and as you said, you were a year younger. I don't have a memory of you in first year, though I may have been a bossy second year. But I do have a very clear memory of the campaign you ran for college president. I thought the first 2 years we'd had such sensational bores that when you came in, you were so compelling that he won hands down. And even though in 2006 he lost his bid for the UN Secretary Generalship, it's that first impression that remains. Why were those years so formative for you at Delhi University?
Well, first of all, I think that's an age at which any experience is going to have a deep impact. I think that's why university years are so special. And of course, in those days, we were slightly younger going into college than today's kids are, because amongst other things, we had 11 years of schooling and not 12. And we usually started off a bit earlier than kids these days do. So my college years were 16 to 19 at St. Stephen's, and then 19 to 22 in the States. And I have to say that that 16 to 19 period is when you are really formed mentally, intellectually, and so on, and even socially in many ways. That's when you begin to get a sense of yourself. It's no longer doing what your parents tell you to do or expect you to do. You have a certain freedom that comes with distance from the home. And at the same time, you're discovering your equations with others, friends, peers, seniors, teachers, and indeed friendships in the outside world for the first time. So for me, that period is formative for anybody. Well, and I think I was lucky that it was St. Stephen's.
Remarkable for all of us. But if I may be immodest for a minute, it was a particular generation that offered the glittering prizes, weren't there? There were some remarkable people who were contemporaries and peers.
Yes, it was. In fact, I've written about this, a letter from somebody who stumbled across a souvenir, I suppose it is, of the production of Antony and Cleopatra at St. Stephen's in 1974, and wrote to me, since I suppose I'm the easiest one to reach, you can always find some way of getting hold of me on the internet, expressing astonishment at the people involved in the production of the cast. Cleopatra was Meera Nair, who went on to make this. She was not a Stephanian, but we used to borrow our female actors from Miranda House, as they used to borrow us for their plays. I think Amitav Ghosh was carrying a spear. Piyush Pandey, who went on to become this great advertising guru, revolutionized Indian advertising, he was there. Amongst the assorted members of the cast were a future Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister of India, a clutch of Indian ambassadors to various countries. It really was an extraordinary time. And when I look at the peers, there were people of all sorts of distinctions. In those days, Chopin Dasgupta and Chandan Mitra were left-wing, right. Couldn't make up their minds whether they were Marxists or Trotskyites.
And a 360-degree turn among the many turns and twists we've seen.
And then they shifted all the way to the right where they had thought I was, and they threw stones at me for that. We had novelists like Rukun Nadwani, Mukul Keshavan, Ghosh, of course, Amitav. Amitav used to go around as a very persistent and somewhat irritating reporter for Roving Microphone of Yuvani on All India Radio. But it really was an amazing galaxy of talent.
Salman Khurshid.
Salman Khurshid ran for president in my first year.
Ramu Damodaran. I mean, it's like a kind of mini encyclopedia.
Siddharth
Basu, my class. Yes, absolutely.
So this was a 3-year period at St. Stephen's College. All these people were there on campus. Quite amazing.
Right. It's sometimes there's a big joke ever since that time, and these names you've mentioned, that there's something in Indian writing called the St. Stephen's School of Fiction.
I'm not sure that's true. I've said it simply because I was asked to respond to the charge that there was a Stephanian school of literature.
I mean, as you say, there's so many. I mean, I'm thinking of your fellow diplomats like Navtej Sarna and many others.
No, Navtej was not a Stephanian. He was Sriram College.
Oh, was he? Pavan Varma?
Pavan Varma, he was,
right,
indeed, also might.
Our contemporary. But your first love has always been writing. You, from a very early age, were putting pen to paper. I mean, you published your first story at the age of 6 in Bombay.
I wrote at the age of 6. I first was published at the age of 10. But the truth is that I was an asthmatic child. And in those days, certainly in Bombay, there was no television. I think you folks in Delhi had black and white TV. We didn't have that in Bombay in the 60s when I was a kid. Obviously, computers and Nintendo weren't even a gleam in people's eyes. So if, as an asthmatic child, you couldn't go out to play, you couldn't even sleep because you were struggling to breathe the whole time, propped up in bed, what could you do? You read. And if you ran out of things to read, essentially, the only things available had to be linked to books. So they had to be either book cricket, at which I was very proficient, or writing. And I began writing rather derivative stories. I mean, I was the oldest child in the family, so I had no elder brothers and sisters to borrow books from. I rapidly exhausted the books in my parents' collection that I could understand. And anytime they took me off to a library to borrow a book, I would finish it in the car on the way home. So I had to write. It was one of those things where I had, Bombay traffic, by the way, it's not just my speed and reading. But anyway, so I would write, and the great blessing I had was a father who took that seriously, encouraged my writing, had the stories typed up so I could show them to friends and family and so on, and that's really how I began to believe in myself as a writer. At 10, my first short story was published. Just before my 11th birthday, what I thought of as a novel, but which now I realize wasn't even long enough to be a novella, was serialized in the Junior Statesman. Where
we all contributed.
Right. That's right. And then I think before the emergency, I had probably appeared in every single English language magazine in India, including Eve's Weekly and Chandamama. Because I used to come home, finish my homework and write.
I mean, Shashi gave you the impression that he had a lot of time on his hands. He didn't, actually. He was an outstanding student academically. And straight from St. Stephen's, he went on to complete his master's at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in America. And had really completed his PhD at the age of 22. Have I got that landmark right?
That's right. I mean, you're right that I had a lot of academic success, but I think really looking back, that it was simply that I was very good at taking exams. I mean, in India, there is that big distinction. I mean, I sometimes wonder about why we do this to our kids, essentially make the examination the yardstick of all sorts of intellectual and academic and scholarly attainment, which it really isn't in many ways. And I'm an example of that because at the end of class 8, when we streamed, I opted for humanities, and my teachers were so upset they summoned my parents to the school and said, this kid has come first in science throughout. We expected him to want to, and of course, like every middle-class family, my parents wanted me to be a doctor too, But I said, I actually dislike the subject. I study for the examination. I forget everything I've learned the day after the exam. Why would you want me to go into this field? I love history. I love literature. Let me be in the humanities. And I was blessed to have a father who was liberal enough to say, all right, do what you want to do, which frankly very few Indian parents, even in our generation, do. I mean, we have tended to try and oblige children to do what we think is good for them rather than follow their bliss. But that's a digression.
I have a feeling that you're oversimplifying here, perhaps because of your enthusiastic audience. I mean, writing an exam isn't really a trick, nor is, in fact, creative writing. It's really it's a very, very hard slog.
Now, what does an exam test? It tests, above all, short-term memory, right? So if you concentrate, if you concentrate hard and slog for the exams, and then you do some tricks, like you don't study so hard on the questions that came the previous year because they won't be repeated, all of this stuff. You actually can, and I wrote very fast, and those days most answers were essay-type answers. They weren't these multiple choice ticking of boxes. So the result was that, yes, I mean, I had what it took, it seemed to me, to pass exams. And indeed, I did so well in the Indian School Certificate, our senior Cambridge examinations, that when I applied for history honours at St. Stephen's, no one with my marks had ever done so. They admitted me without an interview. So, I mean, in some ways, to see that being the only measurement, as it were, struck me as a bit odd. Anyway, it's all academic now, quite literally. It's water under the bridge. But looking back, I think that what our system used to produce in those days, and I fear to a great extent still does, is well-filled minds. And in the era of Google, you don't need a well-filled mind. You need a well-formed mind. Because any fact you want, you can find with 2 clicks of a mouse. What you need is a mind that can actually respond to issues, problems, unfamiliar ones, that the bigger examination called life tosses up your way.
Right, or indeed the creative imagination. I mean, that's the one place where aggregators like Google won't take you. And it's interesting that after completing your master's in America, you straight away joined the United Nations. And your assignment was very arduous in the beginning. It was with UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, and first in New York and then in Singapore was your big test, wasn't it, as a crisis manager?
Well, actually, the organization was, in a sense, chosen for me because the regular UN had national quotas, and even in those days, Indians were overrepresented. So I couldn't have got into the mainstream UN in those days. But UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, didn't have national quotas. And a very kind and very brilliant man who was the only Indian there, Virendra Dayal, formerly of the IAS, Stephanian to boot, took a liking to me. And though he was very correct and wouldn't play any role in my recruitment, he did have me introduced so that I could be interviewed by others who found me suitable for engagement. So hence UNHCR. But having got into UNHCR, it was an extraordinary time because when I joined it, it was a small, largely unknown organization by that time, which had had its heyday, so it was felt, at the end of the Second World War, settling and resettling and rehabilitating the refugees at the end of the Second World War. And when I joined it, it was really small, not at all well known. Everybody in the organization knew each other on a first name basis. And then suddenly everything exploded. You had the Vietnamese boat people crisis. The Soviets marched into Afghanistan, triggering another huge refugee crisis. You had the Somoza dictatorship following in Nicaragua, so refugees in Latin America. There was famine and civil war in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea. There again, there were refugees. Suddenly, the organization quadrupled in strength, quintupled in budget, just, shot up. And I found myself, as it were, thrown into the maelstrom. And I found myself at a rather young age, which I had to conceal from the rest of the world, heading the UNHCR office in Singapore at the peak of the boat people crisis, when the boats are being rescued on the seas and brought into the port. Yeah. And that was an amazing challenge, as you said. It really was in many ways a defining moment for me as a human being as well as a UN official. Because, there's always a feeling that why should the UN be doing humanitarian work? Are we just bureaucratizing our collective conscience? But in fact, the UN actually can do things that well-meaning individuals or church groups or NGOs can't do, because the UN has clout with governments. So I was able, the Singapore government, the last thing they wanted was to allow these refugees off the ships that had rescued them into their country. But because I was the UN, I could hammer on a few doors and get things done. And I could put my head to the pillow at night day after day, knowing that things I'd done during the day had made a difference to human beings' lives.
Well,
that's an amazing, amazing feeling, especially when you're young.
You've spent such a large chunk of your life at the UN, and you just said here is an organization that in a crisis like the boat people, the tragedy that you managed, the UN can do something. We've got a far bigger tragedy on our hands right now. Millions of Syrians pouring in, and all the rich Europeans can do is to just quibble about how many thousands they take. And as for Arab brothers, your son, the Shashi Tharoor, wrote a brilliant piece in the Washington Post yesterday saying, as for the Arab world, the super rich Saudi Arabians, the Gulf states have refused to take even one Syrian. So what can the UN do, and why does the world's conscience go dormant?
Well, it seems to me what the UN should be doing, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the UN Secretary General himself, is hammering on a few doors in these rich Arab states, both for financial succor as well as for some refugee asylum admissions. In Europe, part of the problem is the debate between whether somebody is a refugee or whether somebody is an economic migrant. They have all they've all signed the refugee conventions. They have a legal obligation to give asylum to anybody fleeing persecution. But if somebody is an economic migrant just looking for a better life, they have no obligation to accommodate
but
him.
these 3 million Syrians are lost at sea, many thousands of them. And they're clearly in deep distress, and everybody's slamming doors shut in their face.
And that, as Ishan pointed out in another piece in the Washington Post, is reminiscent of the way the Jews were rejected in so many countries when they were fleeing Nazi persecution in the 1930s. It seems humanity never learns.
Also, the curious fact is, and here I want to bring India, we've weathered such crises with great, I think, generosity and magnanimity. I mean, you remember the Bangladesh war and its aftermath. India took in 10 million Bangladeshis.
The world's largest refugee crisis
ever. And even when the Taliban went on the rampage in Afghanistan, I mean, we took in something like 60,000 Afghanis, if I remember right. 10,000 are still with us. So why do attitudes differ in what is supposed to be a humanitarian, global, equitable, compatible world? And how can diplomacy help?
Well, in India, I think it's partly cultural. We've tended to be hospitable. In fact, you mentioned these, but the one group that's never talked about is the Nepalese fleeing the civil war in that country when the Maoists were at their peak. It's been estimated that as many as 7 million out of Nepal's 27 million people were quietly absorbed into India, including here in Pune. There were entire neighborhoods of Nepalese. So we tend to do this without much of a fuss. Whereas in many of the Western countries, partly because there is a resentment at foreigners coming in and taking advantage of their social welfare benefits, perhaps.
A xenophobia, really.
And that the xenophobia then tends to manifest itself most. And then there are issues of religious difference. Many of those coming in are Muslim, and many of the... I mean, I was struck by the fact that, for example, I think it was Slovakia said they will take 200 refugees, but they all had to be Christians. Now, maybe they might find it hard to find 200 Christians amongst those fleeing, but if they do, they'll take them. Now, that's the sort of attitude that some of these countries have, and clearly we will have a continuing humanitarian tragedy, but consciences are being roused. You saw that very searing and painful picture of the Turkish boy dead on the beach, and an Indian sand artist has also sculpted a very lifelike sand sculpture of this tragedy, and pictures of that have gone around the world as well. People's consciences have been stirred by this, and I think you will see, one hopes you will see a slightly different response. But to ensure that response, the UN must go and bang on a few doors and demand such a response.
Right. In the long years you spent at the UN, and it was a stressful life, crisis managing these terrible, dreadful situations. It was a difficult life. Did writing come as some sort of a release and escape from the very grueling schedule of negotiation, travel, and so on that a UN diplomat leads?
Yes, I mean, it was very much an escape. The Great Indian Novel, which was my first book was actually Reasons of State, which was my PhD thesis rehashed. But The Great Indian Novel, which is my first novel and my first work of hardcover fiction, as it were, that was written when I was at headquarters at UNHCR after my stint in Singapore.
In Geneva?
Sorry, beg your pardon, when I was at headquarters in Geneva after my stint in Singapore. And then the novel Show Business was written in New York when I had just moved there at the end of the Cold War, when, just as UNHCR and the refugee crises exploded after they hired me, when the peacekeepers hired me, I was one of, I remember vividly, 4 civilians and 3 military officers. And again, peacekeeping just exploded at the end of the Cold War. We had multiple operations. There had been just 5 relatively stable ones when I came in. And suddenly we had over 800 people in what became the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. So I always joke that if you really want problems to multiply and you want to expand your workload, your budget and your staff, hire me. It follows immediately. But it didn't work for the Congress Party, so I shouldn't say that. However,
well, you were hanging in there.
no, look, actually, I joined the Congress Party in an election where we did go up, so I shouldn't knock myself. 2009, we went up, we formed the government. I think it's when I stay when I stay longer that perhaps it becomes a little less. It becomes a little less productive. But coming back to the UN. And so, yes, you're right. I wrote, but then, equally, the work made writing impossible. So, for example, this novel Show Business did, I have to admit, better with critics in the Western world than here. But when it came out, it was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, which I think no Indian passport-carrying writer had that distinction. Up to then, Rushdie had, of course, had one, but he was a Brit citizen. And when that thing came out, I was getting inundated with calls from publishers and agents saying, let's have a look at your next manuscript. And I had to say, I'm sorry, I'm handling Bosnia. There isn't another manuscript. And indeed, I couldn't even begin seriously to write one until years later when the Yugoslav crisis had ebbed. And then I wrote India from Midnight to the Millennium. So,
right. But my question was, so you started out really as people often do, an after-hours writer, because you had this huge tour of duty at work. So it was really after hours, or whatever time you could squeeze.
Exactly.
And was fiction, therefore, an easier vehicle?
No, fiction was a more difficult vehicle for that reason, Sunil, because, one thing about fiction is it needs not only time, which, as you rightly pointed out, was scarce anyway. It's scarce for any kind of writing. But it needs a space inside your head to create an alternative world, an alternative universe, to populate it with characters, episodes, snatches of dialogue that are as real to you as what you're encountering in your daily life. It requires building an illusory world. But the problem is that illusion is very easily shattered. And my laptop has been littered, literally, with incomplete attempts at fiction, precisely because every time I would start writing, the real world would intrude, an explosion would go off in Sarajevo, or something dramatic would happen, or I'd have to travel somewhere for a few weeks. And when I came back, I'd find the illusion had been shattered, and that I couldn't just pick up the threads again and re-inhabit the world which had been shattered for me. So I actually turned to nonfiction much more because it's more interruptible. With nonfiction, you can actually reread what you were writing when you were interrupted and pick up the threads, remember the train of your argument or whatever you were saying, and go on with it. And so you'll notice that of my first 5 books, 4 are fiction. My 3 novels and my first collection of short stories, my only collection of short stories, all were amongst my first 5 books. Of my remaining 10, they're all nonfiction. So the fact is that I've had to, circumstances have made me more of a nonfiction writer than perhaps my heart would want me to be. And certainly I always get a lot of fan mail urging me to go back to fiction. But I know that to do justice to it, I really would have not to be contending these days with the daily demands of politics and the legitimate demands of the constituents whose trust I have sought by seeking their votes.
Right. But the curiosity is that of, say, the 15 books you've published, maybe a couple more if you count your marvelous book with M.F. Hussain on Kerala.
I'm counting that on the 15.
Okay. They're really largely about India. What was it like living away from India for so many years? Did that sharpen, heighten your observation in both the fictional imagination and India's rapidly changing realities?
I think so, Sunil. I think any Indian who goes abroad and lives abroad faces an immediate choice, and that is to either seek to assimilate into the place where he or she has moved, or to rediscover the depth and strength of their roots. In my case, I wasn't emigrating. I wasn't making that leap of the imagination that emigration entails. I was an Indian who happened to be working abroad because that's where my job put me. So whether I was working in Geneva or in Singapore or in New York or running around by the way, in New York, I would often joke quite legitimately that if Senator Jesse Helms had his way, they'd relocate us to Timbuktu. So I wouldn't suddenly have to become Malian. I wasn't going to be American. So the fact is, a writer lives in his head and on the page or on the screen these days, on the computer screen. And not so much...
That enforces a kind of tyranny, doesn't it, of its own? Not just an escape always.
Yes, but since I was not writing about what I could look out of the window, I didn't need to look out of the window. I could look at that screen and concentrate on the world that existed only on that screen. And it was usually, as you rightly say, India. There was another reason linked to my work, which is that as a UN official, I had... Early on in my career, I actually asked for official permission to write because I argued that, just as some colleagues, collect butterflies or take photographs or go hiking or whatever on weekends, I write. That's what I do. And so I didn't want that to be deemed a violation of the rules. And so I actually got written permission from UNHCR. And I would always joke that, like James Bond had a license to kill, I had a license to write. But you'll notice, in fact, in those early editions of my books, on the copyright page, if you've got an old copy, there will be the somewhat bizarre words, I'm sure never repeated in any other writer's experience, saying, though the author is an official of the United Nations, none of the opinions expressed by the characters in this book are to be construed as those of the organization or those of the author in his official capacity. Quote unquote. I remember it by heart because I had to come up with it and get it cleared by the lawyers. So that was and therefore, since I couldn't write anything that would offend a member state, but as a citizen of Indian democracy, the one country I could safely offend was India, I wrote about India. And I did offend a lot of people, but I did write about India.
Well, you have a natural propensity, I could almost say genius, for offending much more than India.
Thanks.
Which is what makes you such a delightful person to be in conversation with and as a friend. Now, criticizing India, as you frequently have in your books, is one thing. It's your birthright, every Indian's birthright, to criticize their country. But the most talked about, publicized public speech of yours in recent weeks has been your Oxford Union debate about... I wish this festival a bit better prepared, because for those who haven't seen it, we should have played clips, but go home and look at it on YouTube. It's got, you have, many of you, yeah. And what's unique about it is, of course, is Shashi Tharoor's absolutely brilliant, forensic, witty, insightful foray into history as to why the British should make reparations to India. In the end, of course, he's very modest and says, £1 a year for 200 years will do. Why did you feel that great historic wrong that our colonizers committed had to be redressed? Or should be?
Well, of course it should be. Let me start off by saying, Sunil, that I'm astonished by the huge, stupendous reception this speech has had, because honestly, I've made better speeches.
You know, modesty is his middle name.
But also because I wasn't saying anything that new. I don't know how many people in this wonderfully thronged hall have studied history. But this is what one would call Indian Nationalism 101. I mean, this is what Dadabhai Naoroji said in the 1880s, what Ramesh Chandra Dutt said, what Jawaharlal Nehru wrote. These ideas about the wrongs the British did to us were for me mother's milk. I mean, this is what I read on my own as well as in the classroom. And so for me, I didn't think that I was saying anything new to me or to Indian audiences. Perhaps it was going to be new to the British, and certainly it was obviously a debate, and therefore I had to refute the arguments of the other side. But that was very much the spirit in which I undertook it. And so I'm both surprised and touched by the reaction. Partly, I think it shows that a lot of eyes were opened that, in my view, should have been opened anyway. And I wonder whether there is a generation of Indians that is insufficiently in touch with these basic, almost canonical ideas about Indian history and the Indian nationalist struggle. And whether, therefore, we are in danger of forgetting the elements and forces that have shaped us, shaped our nationalism, shaped the idea of India, that phrase that Tagore came up with decades ago and which has been bandied about rather loosely. But what is that idea? It's certainly shaped by history, by civilization, by culture, and at the same time is sustained by a pluralist idea of Indian democracy, which is what keeps us going. And if young Indians were so surprised by what I had to say, then I worry a little bit about what else they might be surprised by.
I don't exactly remember how many hits Shashi's brilliant Oxford Union speech got, but I will tell you a very funny story about Shashi Tharoor, the king of Twitter. He has, may I correct, introduce 3.34 million followers at the moment. But the funny story is this. I once had to do a TV panel with the beautiful Bollywood actress Priyanka Chopra, who was said to be the queen of Bollywood Twitter. And when I referred to her as such, she recoiled back and said, "No, Sunil, not me. It's the Minister of State for External Affairs. He's way ahead."
Well, yes, I think this was the one activity which, to my astonishment, at an NDTV award ceremony, Shah Rukh Khan and Karan Johar were on stage being interviewed about the use of social media.
And furious with you.
No, not at all.
Because you had more followers.
At that point I did. I don't anymore, believe me. But at that point, so Shah Rukh Khan said, "For me, God is Shashi Tharoor." I wish I had emblazoned that moment, on some sort of permanent disk drive. But anyway, no, I mean, I started the thing, I suppose, by simply being the most visible and prominent of the early adopters. But when you stick your head above the parapet first, it always gets blown off by the attacking forces. And that's what happened to me. Subsequently, I have not only been overtaken by all the others, but as you know, in politics, I still remember Venkaiah Naidu was president of the BJP when my so-called Twitter controversy started. And that must be your phone, Sunil, I have to warn you. And there was this
sharp ears,
breathless hush in the audience, and I realized it wasn't what I was saying that was doing it. But anyway, so Venkaiah Naidu, as president of the BJP, said very sagely, too much tweeting can lead to quitting, which
very good, excellent.
Which turned out to be completely prescient, as it happens, but he now serves a prime minister who has made Twitter and indeed every other form of social media into a fetish. I gave an interview, I remember, to Harinder Babeja in 2009, in which I said, yes, I know that people were saying that Twitter doesn't even sound like a respectable word for a politician to use, and I said, well, Google and Yahoo, when you think about it, are fairly silly words too, right? And everyone's using them. So I said, I guarantee you, I said, within 10 years, most responsible politicians in democracies will be on Twitter. And I didn't have to wait 10 years. It's there in print in an issue of Tehelka at some point in 2009. And by the elections of 2014, it was already the favored medium of Mr. Modi. He made it compulsory, as you know, for all his ministers after they came to power. And social media here.
Even his civil servants.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, what you are...
Civil servants. You know, when I joined the Ministry of External Affairs, my computer couldn't access Twitter. It was barred on government computers.
Right. Well, what you're really suggesting is that you've always been ahead of your time. You've always seen the change coming and grabbed it, and therefore been in tune with a younger, more alive audience. At the same time, sticking your head above the parapet and getting blown off. Why do you get blown off so often, even by your own boss, Sonia Gandhi?
All I can say is don't believe everything you read in the Indian media, especially when it's about me.
And especially when Sunil, this old college mate, is asking the questions.
No, I mean, the fact is that I was a bit taken aback, I must admit. My first year in Indian politics was the rudest baptism, the Agni Pariksha, because, you know, I'd spent 29 years in the UN system being wheeled out to face every conceivable media attack on the UN by every one of the organizations I'd served, UNHCR upwards. And I was the first UN official who appeared on BBC Hard Talk twice, because others were reluctant to do so. I appeared on Fox News, which used to bash the UN every day. Fox News is sort of the Times Now of America, you know what I mean? I'd done all of this, and never once in those 29 years did anyone ever accuse me of putting a word wrong. I was seen as the guy who knew the right thing to say. Then I come here, I use an innocent expression, a very common and banal expression like cattle class. And, you know, the dung hits the roof. It's just amazing. I had my own party chief ministers calling for my resignation because they apparently were unfamiliar with the expression, which had been used by the person who, or the pro-BJP journalist who asked me that question to needle me when the government announced an austerity drive. He said, "Mr. Minister, will you travel cattle class?" So I replied, I thought, you know, with Stephanian humor, "Yes, in cattle class, out of solidarity with all our holy cows," which, now, you would think that if anyone was going to get offended, it would be by the holy cows. But no, they said this man thinks that economy class travelers are all cattle and he's anti-socialist and we must throw him out of government. I was just totally taken aback. If you had Googled the phrase, you'd find it's been around for 30 years and it doesn't attack the passengers, it attacks the airlines for herding us in like cattle into economy class.
When I first read that remark, I just doubled up with laughter in the morning because to me it seemed a classic cooler talk joke. Now, for those of you who don't know, Cooler Talk is this legendary satirical magazine published by St. Stephen's College, of which yours truly was the editor.
Actually, you know, when I was elected president of the union, I had to resign the editorship. It was one of my big regrets because we believe so much in the free press at St. Stephen's that it was assumed that the president of the union could not edit the campus humor magazine. So I had to give that up. Right. Big regret.
I know, and I thought to myself, well, you can take a boy out of St. Stephen's, but you can't take Cooler Talk out of him.
But anyway, you know what happened was I learned one lesson, which actually Shakespeare had written 400 years earlier, which is that the success of a jest, and I'm actually quoting Shakespeare, lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. So in politics, it doesn't matter what you were intending to say. I knew what I was just trying to crack a silly joke. What matters is how it is heard by people, even those who willfully want to hear something other than what you said. But even that realization didn't prepare me for the interlocutor controversy. Interlocutor is a perfectly reasonable word that I was using absolutely correctly. It does not mean intermediary.
On your trip with Manmohan Singh to Saudi Arabia.
In Saudi Arabia. And when I said that the Saudi Arabians are our interlocutors, all it means in diplomatic talk is I'm talking to them. You know, whoever you talk to, you're right now my interlocutor. Right. It does not mean you're my intermediary with her or whatever. So the fact is, suddenly a certain person who...
I wouldn't presume that.
So a certain anchor who specializes in claiming to want to know various things, decided that I had, in the name of the nation, just to make it clear, decided that this was somehow a reversal of Indian foreign policy, and I'd called for Saudi Arabia to be an intermediary, which I hadn't, which cast a complete blight on the poor Prime Minister's trip over 3 days. Now, this is the kind of thing that was happening in the media, and if you ask me, why do you think it was happening? I am still finding it very difficult to believe that I was at fault. I think there were some people who specifically delighted in going after me, and why they felt necessary to do so. Honestly, this was, in this particular case, what wrong exactly had I done that merited this kind of
Shashi,
nationwide front page
what you're
headline?
saying is every politician's burden and song. That's politics for you. But the fact of the matter is, let's leave these two frivolous examples aside, interlocutor and cattle class. The fact is that many believe that at various points in your career, you may have overreached. For example, your 2006 bid to stand for the UN Secretary General's position. Did you seriously think you were going to win?
Absolutely. In fact, we would not, and I say we because the government of India nominated me. Exactly. No, nominated. They came to me with the idea, and we would not have done it if we thought that we wouldn't. I mean, the fact is that there were 7 contenders, which included 3 foreign ministers, a deputy prime minister, and a prince, not to mention the head of state of a UN member state, the president of Latvia. And I beat them all. I just managed to not be beaten and not succeed in getting as many votes as Mr. Ban Ki-moon. But part of the reason was that, of course, we were essentially thinking that I had almost the perfect sort of resume, but this is not a job in the end where it's those credentials that determine the outcome. This is a political decision made by 15 governments on the Security Council, and particularly by the 5 permanent members. And for them, it's ultimately the politics. We've now got this extremely disloyal memoir by the then American ambassador, who has put in black and white. His instructions were, we do not want a strong Secretary General, quote unquote. Now, that's the kind of logic that goes into it. Then the fact that you have a candidate here from India who has done humanitarian and refugees and Security Council and peacekeeping and has led the largest department and reformed the budget and et cetera, all of these things that seem to make me, and been in the Secretary General's office for some years, all of this, which seemed to make me an almost ideal candidate for managing all aspects of the UN's work, that became totally an irrelevant consideration. It was, might he go above the heads of member states? Might he speak the way Kofi Annan, for example, succeeded in appealing to the global public? All of these things. And, you know, I got the message back very clearly from the US side that this was the problem.
Right. But even after you lost, and Ban Ki-moon did have the magnanimity to invite you to rejoin the UN,
he did.
You made a very clear decision. Your diplomatic career was behind you, and you were going to return to your roots, to your homeland, and you were going to plunge into the dirt, the squalor, the canards, the character assassinations of active politics. What made you do that?
Because I didn't realize it would involve all of those things, I think. No, it was partially naivete, I'll admit that. I genuinely thought that I had something to contribute to the processes of governance, having seen it at close quarters and having seen, you know, when you run into as many world leaders and foreign ministers and so on as I did in my career at the UN, you kind of see them as fairly ordinary mortals, not very different from yourself. And you think, well, if they can do it, I can do it too, kind of thing. So it didn't seem to me that I was overreaching in seeking to be involved in the process of governance in my own country. In a democracy, politics is still the most effective way of making a difference in the lives of your people. And to my mind, whereas I could continue to write and make speeches and so on, the way you actually affect people's lives is by making policies and laws. And to do that, you've got to be in government. And unless you've gone through it the bureaucratic route, which I hadn't, then the way available was politics. I also thought I would test myself to see whether I was capable of winning. a mandate from voters, or connecting to them, which of course many people profoundly doubted. I was also contesting a seat which in the 2 previous elections had been won by the communists. So it wasn't as a quote-unquote safe
It's an urban seat, one of the most literate
It's
parts
not
of the
an
country.
urban seat, oddly enough. The capital
Is it
of Kerala,
urban rural?
but the constituency 67% rural. But still, yes, there was a strong urban core of it. And at the same time, there was a literate population that I thought at least might be somewhat familiar with who I was and what I represented. And I went out there and I got their support. And in fact, in the end, my experience of politics taught me a lot. And I'd written books about India from the sort of macro view. I saw the wood but had not toiled amongst the trees. Working amongst the trees today, I mean, it's quite startling. In some ways, a lot of what politics is all about, you don't really discover until you're doing it yourself. For one thing, the work is a lot harder than appears at the surface.
Course.
I know many middle-class educated professionals tend to sneer at politics and politicians. But believe me, they work very hard. And at its best, politics is a kind of extended form of social work, because you're dealing with the problems of individual constituents all the time. And you're dealing with it in order to help them navigate often an unfeeling or unresponsive system, bureaucracy, rules, laws that mystify many people. You're also trying to make policies that look after them. All of us represent populations that are, I would say, about 70% living below the UN yardstick of $2 a day. So our poverty line is about 26%, but if you take the UN $2 a day, then you're looking at 70% of each electorate is poor by global standards. And they're the ones you've got to think about. So I came in with all these ideas about foreign policy. And I realized that I had to think about foreign policy from the point of view of the fisherwoman who's the price of diesel for her boat, or the foreign trawlers invading her space and fishing in her waters. That's the sort of thing that foreign policy had to come down and matter to.
And
so it became a very educated thing. And the second thing, of course, is that a lot of retail politics is, I'm afraid, not intellectually satisfying. I mean, you spend a lot of time with people who want jobs, who want promotions, sure, who want transfers, who want personal issues solved, and see the MP as the instrument to solve those problems from the state. So that you spend a lot of time in those things as well.
Right. What's interesting, of course, about your record as an MP for Thiruvananthapuram is that I think you must be one of the few MPs who actually produces quarterly audited accounts, or something half-yearly.
No, the annual reports, but I publish all the figures.
Right, and you put them on the net, which is fantastic, MPs' funds and so on. Although many thought your victory from the capital of Kerala was a surprise in 2009, it was really a big surprise last year when your party was routed nationally in the most humiliating defeat. Why do you think you got by?
Well, I honestly think that it was simply my work in the first term, because I learned, especially after losing the foreign ministry job, where honestly I was traveling far too much and spending an enormous amount of time in that job, because I was opening up relations with a number of African countries where we hadn't had much contacts before. I was also traveling to Latin America and so on. I had a lot to do in the foreign ministry that kept me away from the constituency. So with hindsight, my resignation from there became a political blessing in disguise, because I was able then to spend time in the constituency attending to its problems. And I got a number of things done that had languished for a long time, of which 2 that I'm particularly proud of. One was the fact that we had a national highway bypass from Trivandrum to the Tamil Nadu border, which had been stuck for 40 years. After they'd laid the stones, demarcated the land, they hadn't actually been able to develop it. And people came to tears in their eyes saying, these wretched stones are on our land. We can't sell the land. No one will buy them because the government could take over the land at any time. So either have the stones removed and cancel the project, or get the darn road built. And I took that on as a challenge, and there have been some very distinguished predecessors in that time, from Krishna Menon to K. Karunakaran. I mean, there's some very famous MPs of Trivandrum. But I was able to undo all these logjams, persuade 3 successive highway ministers and the NHAI bureaucracy and get this thing done. And for people who had been in despair about whether they'd ever see those stones off their land, to actually get 2014 prices for their land from the government was such an ecstatic thing. It transformed votes across the entire that particular belt. And the other thing I was able to do, and I have to thank Stephen for it, because we had a contemporary of ours as chairman of the Railway Board, was that I was able to get 14 new trains to the constituency. Keralites are indefatigable train travelers, and I got that done. And in
Without being Mamta Banerjee.
And in particular, there was one part of my constituency near the Tamil Nadu border where they had a lovely station and no trains ever stopped there. And so I managed to get 3 trains to stop, with the result that people who had to spend 50 rupees and sit in 2 hours of traffic to go by bus to the capital city every day were suddenly spending 10 rupees and going in half the time by train. And obviously they all voted for me.
Right. So what you're really saying is
that people do recognize work.
Yes, what Shashi Tharoor is saying is exactly that people will vote you back if they see work on the ground happening. The problem with you is that you can't stay out of trouble nationally.
Thanks to questioners like this, naturally it'll happen.
I don't just mean, of course, that terrible fracas about the IPL scandal for which you lost your job.
Mm-hmm. Though I still don't understand what the scandal was, and no one can tell me.
I also mean kind of everyday happenings, because you are so upfront about belting out your opinions. Some would say dishing them out. Your support for Swachh Bharat is misconstrued by your party as support for Narendra Modi. The fact that the other day you said the Congress MPs walk out the last session of Lok Sabha was holding up business, and you were rapped on the knuckles by Sonia Gandhi. What is the problem? Is it your enemies in the Congress who are doing this in a conspiracy theory? Or are you a closet Modi supporter? Or is it just the precarious life Congress party MPs must live in a dynasty-driven party?
Oh my God. This is...
Last question. That's my last question.
This is like asking somebody, so when did you stop beating your wife? I mean, how does a person answer it?
Answer it frankly.
Very frankly. Number one, some of the things that you said, I will not confirm or deny, because as a matter of principle, I do not speak about discussions that took place behind closed doors. Clearly, others have taken it upon themselves to do so and to leak distorted accounts of what happened behind closed doors. But I can tell you that that's not my style. It never has been, and I wouldn't have got to where I'd got in the UN if that had been my style. So I'm not going to do it. What I will say, talk about things that I've said openly. And openly, yes, I have an approach to politics that says if my opponent does something that I find laudable, I should acknowledge it. Now, that is not, however, the idiom of our politics, or indeed of the world. I don't know, there are people of my generation sitting here, I'm sure, who remembers how in cricket in our time, if an opposing batsman scored a century, the fielders were the first to applaud. In tennis, I still remember Ramanathan Krishnan and Vijay Amritraj applauding the passing shots of their opponents as the ball whizzed past them on the court. That was the spirit in which you were supposed to entertain each other and deal with each other on the basis of respect. That used to be the currency of Indian politics. It no longer is. And I have to say, I do start off blaming the BJP for the debasement of our political discourse in the course of the 10 years of the UPA, which unfortunately has set an example that many in the Congress wish to emulate. I don't know how many of you went to Christian missionary schools and studied the Golden Rule, which says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, in politics, the Golden Rule now is, do unto others what they have done unto you. So So now we're very busy doing to the BJP what the BJP did to us. And yes, I mean, I wish it were a different era. I wish we didn't have to. But obviously, as a loyal member of the party, I have no choice but to go along with what my party determines is the right way to behave. But I can express the wish that it didn't have to be this way. On the question of whether I'm a closet Modi supporter, do I have a bearded skeleton in my closet? No, I don't. Look, I'm on record for some years. I mean, I have a paper trail going back about 30 years of published writings, which anybody who has read me has a pretty good idea what I stand for and believe in India. It is very much a vision of a pluralist India, an India which is and should be home for everyone, of every religion, every caste, every creed, every political belief. That's been the vision that Indian nationalism fought for. We never fell into the trap of the kind of bigoted, divisive politics of the Pakistan movement, and we're not going to, I hope, ever become a larger scale Pakistan. So to my mind, the pluralist India that I stand for starts off from a fundamental set of premises different from that which animates the BJP. And because our premises are so different, I can't make common ground with them. There may be specific things they say or do that I don't disagree with, but what's wrong with that? Surely there are specific things we have done in the Congress that modestly responsible people in the BJP could agree with. Let's start saying this about each other. Swachh Bharat, the Prime Minister of India, invites a number of citizens, none of whom were BJP members, to support him in cleaning up the country. It's a subject I've written about. Mahatma Gandhi said in 1929, sanitation is more important than independence. I thought this is therefore something that the Congress party would have no difficulty with. I was wrong. But the fact is that I supported it because I felt that was my duty as an Indian citizen to do. And it's also true that I've since been disappointed with the way in which Swachh Bharat has been carried out. It has unfortunately been, as I warned, and anybody can find my column at NDTV the day I accepted this offer from the Prime Minister. I warned against it becoming reduced to photo ops, grandees with brooms on Gandhi Jayanti, who would never pick up another broom again till the next Gandhi Jayanti and the next camera. And that's exactly what happened. I cleaned up a beach in my constituency. I involved the local residents and the local stakeholders. And I wrote to the Prime Minister saying, you know, what you need really is something far more fundamental in terms of waste management. It will need central government involvement and major funding to scale up if you want to clean up India. Because it can't be done without money. It's as simple as that. What has the BJP government and Mr. Jaitley's budget done? They have slashed the budget for sanitation. So Swachh Bharat spends 5 times the advertising and publicity budget that the UPA government had, and only 80% of how much the UPA spent to do this. Now, is this right or wrong? I mean, this is the question I ask you all.
Well, it's been such a joy to talk to Shashi Tharoor over such a range of issues. I've enjoyed every minute of it. I hope you have. What we are now going to do is to take a certain number of select questions, if anybody in the audience has questions. Is there a spare mic?
There seems to be one right in front of you. There's a mic right in front of you, if that works. And if you'll take the wired mic, you can give that other one too.
I have 2.
Yeah, you can have this one too. Then two people can be given mics. It would save time.
It would be nice if you identified yourself before asking the question.
Good evening, sir. First of all, I'm a huge fan and I'm really thrilled to be here.
Thank you.
I'm a second year student in the Media College of Symbiosis. And my question is, one of your lesser known books, coming back to your writing, is the one I'm carrying right now, Nehru, The Invention of India. So I was really curious to know because in a lot of your other books, for example, The Elephant, Tiger and the Cell Phone, you've written about a lot of eminent personalities that have come out of India, but this is the only definitive biography you've ever attempted. So what triggered your fascination about Pandit Nehru?
Because genuinely, you know, he is somebody who has shaped in so many fundamental ways the India I've grown up in, the India that we take for granted, that I was irresistibly fascinated by him. And then the Vajpayee government, the first NDA government was ruling then, and there was an effort on, not as extensive and systematic as now, to trash what Nehru stood for, to discredit Nehru. So I thought it would be a very good time to look back on his life. And so I started reading up, not only his own books, which are fabulously interesting reading, but a lot of his speeches, a lot of contemporary accounts of Nehru. When Nehru died, there were compilations published of various things about him and so on. And from there, the portrait that emerged of Nehru in my mind, I felt was worth sharing with the Indian people. I published the book in 2003 when it didn't look, frankly, as if there was any prospect of Nehruvianism coming back. As you all know, the results of the election in 2004 were a surprise to everybody, including the winners. But the fact is that in 2003, I thought one should look back on the life of Nehru from that early 21st century perspective and say, if we are trying to discard this man's legacy, let's understand what he stood for, what the legacy was. So it has the great merit of being short. Because all
Did
the
you
good
advise it to
biographies...
Prime Minister Modi also?
I'm sorry?
Did you advise Prime Minister Modi to go through this book because you felt the BJP government wasn't doing justice to his legacy?
I didn't. I would have been perhaps more immodest than even I'm capable of. But why don't you suggest it to the Prime Minister? It won't take him too long to read.
Next.
Sir, since he had already stole the question, I have the same book to start with. One advantage of being on the organizing committee is I have the mic. It's been a privilege. I sent you a mail in 2013. Unfortunately, you couldn't make it to the Pune Lit Fest.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and in 2014 and 15. So Pune Literature Festival has got third time lucky.
Great. I'm very pleased. I'm lucky to be here and have such a wonderful audience. Thank you all for being here.
I have a question again pertaining to since you are a loyal member of the Congress Party and you have your opinions, positive and negative. And I was lucky enough to compare the book launch for another Stephanian, Professor Ram Guha. You have all Stephanians are like they can talk on cricket, current affairs, anything and everything under the sun. They're quite eloquent about it. My question is, if you consider the dynasty, Mr. Nehru was a slow starter. He just joined the movement under Mahatma. Indira Gandhi was a slow starter. They called her the Googie Gudia. And then she rose up to a very dominant position. Rajiv Gandhi was on the sidelines. His younger brother had sort of taken over. And then he was put into the spotlight. But he made his mark in the short time. Rahul Gandhi has been a slow starter, as a lot of people have been. But after his particular sabbatical, I don't know what he had, a Red Bull or whatever, he's been very aggressive. So would you say this is the start of the Rahul Gandhi era?
I think so, yeah. No, listen.
You're blotting your copy book.
First of all, let me take you back to the past. You know, when Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister, a lot of people said, can't we do better than a 40-year-old airline pilot with no governmental experience and so on? And he turned out to be one of the most innovative, effective, dynamic prime ministers. He was hugely popular until, of course, he was laid low by the Bofors scandal. But he managed to resolve a number of crises, the Punjab crisis, the Assam crisis, the first attempt at peace at Mizoram. He was able to accomplish a great deal, and indeed, an attempt at peace at Sri Lanka, which in the end did not end well for us, but had begun well. So Rajiv Gandhi's accomplishments belied the reception he was given at the start. Rahul Gandhi has come back from this sabbatical, and he has hit the ground running. And I can tell you, if you just talk to those who have encountered him since then, in the last 3 months or so, who've seen him in action, you wouldn't react like this, because you've really seen somebody who is on the ball, who's focused, who's dedicated, who is giving fully of himself, and who at the same time has his fingers on the hot button issues that are affecting ordinary people in this country. Don't write him off, because I can assure you that famous line from Mahatma Gandhi, you know, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then you win. I think that's going to be happening with Rahul Gandhi too.
Sir, excuse me, sir. Dr. Tharoor, I want to hear, sir.
Ah, okay.
My name is Varun Bhakia. I'm from Norojji Wadia College. I'm studying 11th Arts. First of all, your speech at Oxford was brilliant.
Thank you.
I was in splits at the way you delivered it. It was quite funny, as well as
No, it was meant to be.
found out a lot more than we find out from books in the internet. I wanted to say that now OROP has come out into the open big time. Like lots of veterans are at Jantar Mantar. And to me, it's a bit of a personal issue because my grandfather and father, both with the armed forces, I maybe shouldn't be saying this because both of them were government servants in general. So
That's why you should be saying it.
I don't know, sir. Maybe somebody would tell me to toe the line. So anyway, the BJP government has been in power for 1 year now, and OROP has been there for 35 years. So I don't want to know what the Congress party thinks about what they did for it in 10 years, 2004 to 14. I want to know what you think the party could have done before 2004.
Well, I'm strongly in favor of it, and if you'll see my column on New Year's Day 2015, this year, you will actually, if you could just go on ndtv.com, Google it, you will see what I've had to say about one rank, one pension. I think it's an injustice that it hasn't been done. I think we should have done it earlier. I believe, however, that we allowed the issue to be held back by the fiscal constraints of the government at that time. But eventually, in the last UPA budget, it was granted. Then the BJP came to power, and they reaffirmed this decision. And many of you will remember Mr. Modi standing on Siachen a year ago, saying, "I'm so proud that I've given you one rank, one pension." But the action never followed. And this has been one of my problems with the present government, is we have a lot of announcements, a lot of statements, very little action. The gap between the statements and the action is vast. So in this particular instance, I'm sorry to say, this is an unimplemented promise. The defense minister at one point made a statement saying he'll be prepared to grant 80% of what the soldiers ask. But we don't tell the soldiers, you make 80% of an effort, or you come back with 80% of the Kargil heights.
2 more questions. Yes, please.
Hello,
Yes.
I'm Anmesh Shetty from Symbiosis Center for Media and Communication. Since you've been the External Affairs Minister, what do you feel about the NSA level talks with Pakistan that just went off, and also the foreign policies of the current government in general?
Well, I think the foreign policies of this government have been okay where they have followed the established paths. In many cases, there's been a lot of continuity. However, in some areas, and I certainly credit Mr. Modi with having brought a lot of personal energy and dynamism into his personal conduct of foreign policy. But on some issues, notably on Pakistan, there's been a bewildering inconsistency, which implies that they haven't got the foggiest idea what they want and how to get it. We've seen, since you mentioned specifically Pakistan, you see, first of all, the BJP in the election campaign bashes Pakistan, attacks us of giving chicken biryani to visiting Pakistani leaders. Then suddenly we invite Mr. Nawaz Sharif for better than chicken biryani, the inauguration of the PM. Then saris and shawls are exchanged. Then we start firing on the border and firing back at them and artillery exchanges. Then we have foreign secretary talks announced. Then we cancel those talks because the Pakistanis are doing what they've always done, which is talk to the Hurriyat. Then we again have tension. We have Mr. Modi sitting in Kathmandu at SARC, ostentatiously reading a brochure when the Pakistani Prime Minister walks past him. Then you've got suddenly new peace diplomacy. He calls Pakistan and wishes them good luck in the World Cup. When they're playing us, the last thing we want to wish them is good luck against us. Then you send the foreign secretary on a SARC yatra. Then you announce new talks. Then you have this meeting in Ufa, completely unprepared, no homework done. Nation not prepared for it. Dramatic new statement coming out. NSA talks announced. NSA talks cancelled. I mean, is this a way to conduct foreign policy in such an important relationship? It's more swings of the pendulum than a defective grandfather clock. You know, I mean, it's just astonishing. So my worries, I think they need to be a little more measured. They need to do their homework. They need to look at the established patterns and the existing achievements of Indian foreign policy. This is one area where normally we have taken the view that our political differences stop at the water's edge. We don't have a BJP foreign policy and a Congress foreign policy. We have an Indian foreign policy. But the BJP needs to conduct itself that way.
Right.
Thank you so much.
One last question.
Good
last
evening,
question.
sir. Good evening, sir.
We haven't had a young lady. We haven't had a single woman. This young lady, please.
But I have the mic in my hand.
How do you know she's single?
We are here today to listen to Shashi Tharoor read a book. Just excerpt
Is that possible?
that book.
Okay, certainly. With pleasure.
Can we anything from that book?
Okay, then
Certainly.
let's take his question. I'll read
Last
a
question.
page or two from this.
Good evening, sir. Myself, Aniruddha Kulkarni. I'm a budding lawyer.
Uh-huh.
So I have two questions. The first question is, after coming to India and after getting into politics, first you were Minister of State for HRD. After that, being into international diplomacy and politics for 29 years, was it demeaning for you to get a state portfolio rather than a proper Minister of External Affairs? Come on. A person who was Under Secretary General gets a state portfolio. This is the first question. And the second question,
One question.
No, it's related. And it's again a controversy.
He is a lawyer.
The second question is, recently the government announced that people who are pursuing postdoctoral studies in international law, they would be allowed to get into MEA, and the diplomats and the people who have passed out through UPSC, like who are already in the Indian Foreign Service cadre, they felt that they would be getting sidetracked by these people coming into the MEA. So what is your view on that? So
Okay.
two questions.
So on the first one, very frankly, I have to recognize that whatever my experience and my seniority in the world outside, in politics I'm considered pretty junior. I'm considered somebody who's relatively new. I have to earn my stripes and my seniority. And in fact, in many ways, I would advise people who want to get into politics mid-career not to wait as long as I did. Get into it early when you can still sort of climb your way up, rather than come in your advanced years and find yourself being treated as somebody relatively low down the pecking order, because these are all people, there are people younger than me who've served twice as long as I have in politics by having gone in from their student days and worked hard, and it's not unreasonable that they should feel entitled to their seniority because of their long years of service in the party and in politics. That's the way the party tends to be, and I have to, if you're playing a new game, play by the rules of that game, so I accept that. Secondly, the issue that you're describing is one that I've advocated for quite some time as an MP, and in my book, Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century, I have an entire chapter about reforming the MEA, where this is one of my suggestions. We need to get in more mid-career people. We are a grossly understaffed diplomatic corps. Our diplomatic corps is roughly the size of the diplomacy of Singapore or New Zealand. Right? Even Brazil is 1.5 times our size. China is 4 times our size. And to give you numbers, we have about 890 diplomats. Brazil has 1,200. China has 4,200. Okay, the United States has 20,000, but we're not going to. There are more people in the U.S. embassy than we have in the MEA. So the fact is that we really have to understand that in order to be able to hold our own, we need to increase our strength. And if we can't do it slowly by simply increasing the intake every year, which is what we're finally doing, because that, to my mind, will simply give us a number of people who are ready 10 years from now, whereas we need to be ready today. And for that, we need to get in some mid-career people. I've advocated this as a writer, I've advocated this as an MP, and I've advocated it as chairman of the External Affairs Committee. So when we pushed the Foreign Secretary into this, it was then that this announcement came, that they would accept mid-career people only in the policy planning division of the MEA. But we accept that as a beginning, and we hope that it will be used to fill other gaps. Whether you need a climate change negotiator, get somebody from the academic world. You need a public relations specialist, get someone from the private sector. Let's move out now and expand our capacities. Now, this lady wanted me to read something, and obviously fiction would have been more fun, but time is also very scarce. So I'll read just a couple of pages from the beginning of the book, Nehru, simply because since he says it's relatively less known than some of my other books, it might perhaps tempt some of you into seeing it's not just another political biography. There is some mischief in it too. So this is the beginning of the first chapter. In January 1889, or so the story goes, Motilal Nehru, a 27-year-old lawyer from Allahabad in UP, traveled to Rishikesh, a town holy to Hindus up in the foothills of the Himalayas on the banks of the sacred river Ganga. Motilal was weighed down by personal tragedy. Married as a teenager, in keeping with custom, he had soon been widowed, losing both his wife and his firstborn son in childbirth. In due course, he had married again, an exquisitely beautiful woman named Swarup Rani Kaul. She soon blessed him with another son, but the boy also died in infancy. Motilal's own brother, Nandlal Nehru, then died at the age of 42, leaving Motilal the care of his widow and 7 children. The burden was one he was prepared to bear, but he desperately sought the compensatory joy of a son. This, it seemed, was not to be. Motilal and his 2 companions, young Brahmins of his acquaintance, visited a famous yogi renowned for the austerities he practiced while living in a tree. In the bitter cold of winter, the yogi undertook various penances, which, it was said, gave him great powers. One of the travelers, Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, informed the yogi that Motilal's greatest desire in life was to have a son. The yogi asked Motilal to step forward, looked at him long and hard, and shook his head sadly. "You," he declared, "will not have a son. It is not in your destiny." As a despairing Motilal stood crestfallen before him, the other man, the learned Pandit Deendayal Shastri, argued respectfully with the yogi. The ancient Hindu Shastras, he said, made it clear that there was nothing irreversible about such a fate. A great karma yogi like him could simply grant the unfortunate man a boon. Thus challenged, the yogi looked at the young men before him and finally sighed. He reached into his brass pitcher and sprinkled water from it 3 times upon the would-be father. Motilal began to express his gratitude, but the yogi cut him short. "By doing this," the yogi breathed, "I have sacrificed the benefits of all the austerities I have conducted over many generations." The next day, as legend has it, the yogi passed away. 10 months later, at 11:30 p.m. on 14 November 1889, Motilal Nehru's wife, Swarup Rani, gave birth to a healthy baby boy. He was named Jawaharlal, precious jewel, and he would grow up to be one of the most remarkable men of the 20th century. That's how the book begins.